Welcome to Exploring Engineering.
Our first speaker will be Emily Hops.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well today. Thanks so much for joining the webinar, and a special thank you to Lily for coordinating this. I think it's a really important topic as we are going to continue as a society to need lots of well-trained engineers in all sorts of STEM fields. So I'm happy to be here to chat with you a little bit today about my role in that. So I do have some slides that I prepared. Hopefully everyone can see that. But again, my name is Emily Hops. I am a professional civil engineer. I have a degree in civil engineering with a concentration in structural engineering from Northeastern University. I've spent my entire career, shockingly, at one firm named Simpson, Gumpertz, and Heger, where I work as a consulting engineer, mainly focused on building enclosures. And we'll talk in a little bit about what that means and what I actually do at my job. But first, I'll start with a little bit of why did I choose civil engineering? How did I end up here anyway? I have always liked architecture. I've always been intrigued with buildings. When I was maybe 12 years old, my parents took me to one of Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, and it just blew my mind. It was the first time I had ever thought about how much care and planning and meaning really went into the buildings that we were building, that they weren't just walls and roofs going up, that there was a lot more that went into it. And I just, I thought this concept was so cool that there was someone out there thinking about how buildings fit into their environment and how nature was important and how being part of that was something we needed to think about. I also knew that I probably wasn't an architect. I wasn't much of an artist. I didn't have a portfolio of work. That was just never my thing. I was a math and science nerd. So I was looking for ways that I could use those strengths that I had to be part of something like this. And when you look at a building like this, it's really easy to think about, how it looks and how it fits into the scenery. But how do you do that? How do you get that building to hang over a waterfall and stand up? How do you put a building into a river and not get leaks inside of it? It was just fascinating to me. And that's really where the civil engineering comes in, is how do you make that vision work? Another great example to me of how I ended up in civil engineering is the Brooklyn Bridge. And if you ever want to read something about civil engineering, there's lots of great books out there about the Brooklyn Bridge and fascinating stories. One of my favorites that just sounds so simple but was really intriguing to me was the anchor plate that they used in the ends, the big abutments you see there for the Brooklyn Bridge. There's big, heavy weights that sit in the bottom of those that hold all those cables down, which actually hold up the bridge. And we could talk for hours just about bridges and all the interesting, cool things I think about them. But when you look at the image of that plate, it's not a square, it's not a circle, it's not a triangle. It's this very interesting star shape. And that's because the engineers figured out that's how it would be most efficient. You put the weight towards the center of it because that's where you need it to be to work most efficiently. It's the same reason I-beams are shaped like eyes, because that's the way you can figure that material to make it most efficiently and leave out material where it's really not going to be helping anything. So to me, that concept just sort of blew my mind. And the other interesting thing that I find about the Brooklyn Bridge is that Washington Roebling, who was the architect and engineer for the bridge, actually got really sick during its construction, and his wife took over. And most people don't appreciate just how much she did. She was an architect, she was an engineer, way ahead of her time, and her name was Emily too. So I always thought that was pretty cool. Just a few more examples of civil engineering things that really intrigued me and got me interested. Maybe you've been to San Francisco and you've seen these cable cars that go up and down these huge hills, and you're on them and you're kind of nervous, like, how is this going to get up? How is it not going to slide backwards? How is it not going to go out of control down the hill? And there's actually a museum there, and you can go to it for free if you're ever in San Francisco. There's a little photo in my slide there. Huge gears and pulleys and wires underneath all the streets of San Francisco that work together to pull those cable cars up and down the hill. And it's something that, you know, until you go to a museum like that and really stop to think about how that works, you don't realize it. And then to me, it's just fascinating that that's how it works. That's the civil engineers. That's what they built. And one last one, maybe you had the opportunity to go to Barcelona and see the Sagrada Familia, which hopefully is actually going to be 100% complete sometime soon. It's been a long time in coming. And there's so many cool things about this building too. And architecturally, it's just stunning and fascinating to me. But if you actually look at the picture in the upper left, those are mini weighted bags with strings on them. And if you were to be able to flip that over and look at it, it would have the shape of the Sagrada Familia. And that's how the engineers were thinking about it and designing it, upside down, to figure out the weight and the forces and how to put this whole building together. So just another really cool thing to me, and part of the reason why I was so interested and intrigued in civil engineering. So what is civil engineering? What does that actually mean? What does it include? Civil engineering is the oldest form of engineering that we have. I think in the very early days, it would have been considered more like military engineering. And that's why it is called civil engineering, because at some point in history, we had to separate what we were doing for military for what we were doing for non-military or civil structures and infrastructure. So that's why we call it civil engineering. But, you know, the first person who laid a log over a stream so that it would be easier to get across it was doing civil engineering. The first person who built a roof over something and had it stand up to stay dry and to stay cool was doing civil engineering. The Great Pyramids of Egypt were made by civil engineers. The Great Wall of China, holy moly, what an amazing feat of human engineering. The Roman aqueducts, not only a structural engineering feat to be able to build those amazing structures throughout the country, but a water resource feat of actually now moving water and getting it where it needs to go. That is civil engineering. So when you look at the world around you, when you think about all the infrastructure underneath you, that is civil engineering. So, you know, when you go into a major in civil engineering, that's actually a very broad thing. And maybe that doesn't surprise you now that I'm sort of explaining to you what this is, but that could mean a lot of different things. And that's why when I talked to you at the beginning about being a civil engineer with a concentration in structural engineering, that was sort of an important designation, because there's a bunch of primary branches of civil engineering. There's the structural, making sure things go together, stay up, don't fall down. There's environmental engineering. There's geotechnical engineering, which is ground and soil and foundations. Transportation engineering, those are civil engineers who design the highways, who design the roadways. You see the people out doing testing, figuring out what traffic patterns work best. Those are civil engineers. Water resource engineering, people who did the Roman aqueducts, water resource engineers, and we still need them probably even more today. And then construction management, because it's one thing for the engineers to come up with these ideas and figure out how to make things work. Someone's got to go out and build it and figure out how you actually get from there being nothing to this amazing structure that you're going to build. And the coolest thing about some of that is every single one is unique. In civil engineering, there is no such thing as two of the same. Even if you think about it in single terms of the CVS pharmacy where they have the same drawing and the same plan. Well, you're building that on a different piece of land where there's different weather, where there's different materials available, where there's a different work source with skills. So we need all of these people to help figure that out because every single thing we build is unique and different in some way. There's a bunch of different other more specialized areas within civil engineering, which you see around the edge of my diagram. There's architectural engineering, which in hindsight is probably what I wanted to be and probably closest to what I actually practice today, but it is relatively new and not something that has been something you could focus on for very many years. There's coastal engineering, there's planning and survey engineers, urban planners, people like that usually have civil engineering backgrounds. Forensic engineering. So this is a really cool part of my job, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but things don't always work the way we plan them, right? This is part of engineering. This is part of the engineering process. You try something, you figure out what works, you figure out what didn't, and you make changes. So a lot of us do forensic work where something didn't go quite as planned, and you get to go do CSI for buildings or CSI for bridges or tunnels or whatever it is that you like to look at and figure out what didn't go quite right and how to make it better. Everything we build with and make is made out of materials. So there's materials engineers out there who understand all the different kinds of materials that we use to make buildings: metal, concrete, wood. So many different kinds of materials go into buildings and bridges and other pieces of infrastructure today. Those are very important contributors. And of course, earthquake engineering, especially in certain parts of the country and the world, that is important as well. And I'm almost always working on a multidisciplinary team. I mean, I work at a civil structural firm, but we have architects on our team. We have architectural engineers. We have mechanical engineers, because inside buildings, the way they operate, the temperature, the humidity, the pressure, that all plays into all these other components of the building, and you can't think of them separately. We have geologists, people who understand rock and soil and minerals and all those components. We have metallurgists, people who can look at metal under a microscope, think about rust and corrosion and how things are going to perform in the long term. And we have construction engineers who then help us think about how you're actually going to build something and put it together. All right, so that's great. What do I actually get to do at my job? What are the kinds of things that I get to work on as a civil engineer who focuses on building enclosures? So a building enclosure, to me, is the entire outside of the building. If you think of the structure as like the bones of a building, the building enclosure is the skin. It's what keeps the outside out and the inside in. So that's roof, that's walls, that's windows, that's whatever's in the below grade, below ground areas. And I'm thinking about keeping water out. I'm thinking about keeping warm air here, or maybe cool air in another climate inside the building. I'm thinking about making sure it's comfortable to work in those spaces. I'm thinking about making sure that we don't get condensation or mold growth inside of our buildings and compromise people's health and well-being. I'm thinking about energy efficiency of the building. And is this building working in a way that we're not using our natural resources more than we should to operate this building? And how can I improve that? So one of the cool things about my job is I get to work on all different types of buildings, both existing and new buildings. So this may be a building you recognize. This is the Great Dome at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, not far from where we are in Wayland. One of my favorite projects that I have worked on, I did a couple things out there. For a long, long time, this dome was leaking to the inside, and that was due to some aging of the building. It's quite old at this point, and some techniques and materials that they had available to them at the time it was built that just weren't working right anymore. So I got to go up there and I got to do some tests and I got to figure out why it was leaking. And then I got to take it apart and understand what the existing construction actually was and come up with a design to make it stop leaking. So you can see in the upper right corner of my slide there, it's sort of all taken apart. We took all that limestone that you see off. We put a new waterproofing under it. We put some new copper flashing on it, and we put the stone back. And if you went up there today, on the outside, it looks pretty much the same as it did before, but it doesn't leak anymore. So we were able to take the existing building, maintain the existing look, but make it perform much better, and it will perform that way for quite a while. The other cool thing on this project is there's a skylight at the top of that dome that had been covered over in World War II to make sure that it didn't become a beacon for enemy bombers, would it ever get to that point. And finally, we were able to reopen that and relight the space underneath. Their original design was just these small glass blocks all put together, which we didn't think was our best option given all the materials and technology we have now. So you can see in the upper left photo, we were able to put a more modern skylight over the top of it, keep the glass blocks, so that's what you see on the inside, and match the aesthetic to the prior aesthetic, but have something that was gonna perform well and be durable for a lot longer. Here's another similar type of repair project that I got to work on. This was a big, intricate tower, actually in upstate New York at a private high school. And when they called us out, they were really worried about a lot of the decorative elements on these towers and other pieces of their campus being loose and potentially being fall hazards. You can see in the upper right some gaps between those stones that made them concerned. So we ended up actually taking this tower down, stone by stone by stone, labeling all the stones because you can see that's not a repeating pattern there. Every stone is unique. Building the tops of those walls back up using more modern material. You can see there's like a black membrane on there. That's actual waterproofing, which they didn't even have at the time that this was built. And new roofing and new materials, and then putting it all back together. The photo in the upper left is what it looked like when we got there. The photo in the lower right is what it looked like afterwards. And hopefully to you, you look at that and you go, it doesn't look like you did anything at all. And that's exactly what we wanted. This was so beautiful and so important to the people at that school that it looked just like this, that we didn't want to disturb that at all. But we were able to build it back in a way that was going to perform better and have a longer lifespan and have them be able to enjoy it for many, many, many more years to come. I also get to work on new buildings and new construction. You may recognize this one if you've been over to Northeastern before. So big excitement for me to get to work on some projects at my alma mater. But this is a new engineering and science building that was constructed there. So I'm not the one that has the vision, right? There's an architect on the team who has this amazing vision of this shape of this building with these catwalks and fins hung off the outside of it, and these really interesting shaped skylights and spiral staircases on the inside. My job is to say, that looks amazing. How do we make that work? How do we make it so it doesn't leak, so it stands up, so that it looks good for a long time, so that we can clean it and maintain it? And that was, what we did on the building. So we helped the architects and the owner with the design, and we look at how they want it to look. And then we look at all the components that make that up and figure out how to put it together in a way that's going to work. And then we test it. So you can see on the bottom there, we actually built a mock-up of part of this wall. This was kind of cool too. We ended up having to build this overseas in the Netherlands. So I had to take a trip over there to look at it, but a big jet engine fan there, because we know that we need to make sure buildings can perform well in high wind and with air pressure differentials across them. So we actually use those jet propellers to simulate that and test all kinds of things about this building in a warehouse somewhere else, so that we know when we start putting it together on site that all those puzzle pieces we're putting together in that way are going to work out. And here's one that's a little interesting. This is another building that you'll see on MIT's campus if you go over there. But this one was a little different in that the site for the building where it was going to be put up was tight. There wasn't a lot of space around it to store materials and park vehicles, and you couldn't close down the road to get access. So what you see in the lower left is this wall. The walls of this building were actually all made together off-site in a workshop, laying down on their side. And once all the layers of the wall, the insulation and the waterproofing and the brick you see on the outside and the structure that holds all those pieces together were all put together, they were lifted up on a truck and driven to the site. And then you can see them sort of in the lower right there being hung on the building. So this is where it's cool, where if you look at like all the pieces that you're putting together, it's not that different from other buildings. But now we have this different problem that we need to solve of how do we do that on this site where we don't have great access? And then how do we actually get these panels there and hang them up on the building and connect them to each other in a way that those connections aren't vulnerable? So that's one of my favorite things about the job is, even though it may look like something you've seen before, there's always something different there. We always have this opportunity to innovate and come up with new processes and ideas. And sometimes we've got to think small in what I do. I mentioned before a little bit about materials and needing to really understand the nuances of what makes up those materials, what they can do, what they can't do. This is a problem I looked at where there were actual blisters in a coating on a floor. And we had to figure out why and how to stop it. So this is definitely a CSI case where we went out, we got some of the fluid that was in the blisters, we took samples of the concrete and the coating, we looked at it under our microscopes, which you can see in the upper right there, to try to figure out at a small scale what was going on to make this bigger picture issue in a building occur. So really fun sort of forensic problem solving with that kind of stuff. And I'm lucky enough, my company actually has a laboratory where we can do chemical testing and physical testing. We have microscopes and all kinds of cool things to do these kind of tests and zoom in when we need to on these big buildings. Being out in the field, I think, you know, you talk to anyone who does what I do, and we love the fact that we're not just behind a desk. We get to be out in the field. We get to look at buildings. We get to take them apart. We get to put them together and figure out what's going on. And it just makes it sort of a really fun, adventurous kind of job to have. I don't personally do the hanging off the side of the building. That's a little step beyond what I want to do, but lots of our staff do that, get specially trained in rope access and rope link to be able to go out on buildings and bridges and other pieces of infrastructure and do this. And, you know, a big part of what we do helps our planet, or that's our goal, is to help the planet. We know that we have lots of things going on in our world today, and our built infrastructure is really important to that. So I mentioned before, looking at the energy efficiency of a building, making sure that the inside air, all that warm heated air, isn't leaking out everywhere, that you've got the right amount of insulation in the building, that you're using the right materials, that you've designed something that if it's in a flood zone or someplace where a few years from now, the water table may be much higher or much different than it is now with global warming, that we're thinking through all of those things, planning for that in the buildings that we have, testing for it, and trying to set ourselves up so that our current buildings and our new buildings will perform better under those circumstances. So I'm just about out of my time here, I think, but so is civil engineering right for you? This was actually interesting, and I saw this in one of CNBC's articles in the last few months. What are the 5 most valuable college majors? And it wasn't surprising to me to see that architectural engineering and construction services, which are, you know, very, very similar and closely tied to what I do, were considered the 2 most valuable college majors out there. We're always going to have a built environment, whether it's new buildings, existing buildings, pipelines, bridges, tunnels. We're always going to need them. We're always going to have to repair them. We're always going to need new ones. And here's my sort of top 5 or 6 of, you might be a civil engineer if you drive your parents crazy, taking things apart, and maybe sometimes you put them together. But if you're someone who really wants to understand how something works or why it's not working, and you can't help but take it apart, you might be a civil engineer or another type of engineer. You are creative, you love to make things, but maybe you're not necessarily artistic. You might be a civil engineer. You love puzzles and any sort of problem-solving games. If that's your idea of a fun Saturday afternoon, you may be an engineer. The thought of being at a desk all day, every day, is not very appealing to you. You like to be outdoors. Civil engineering, spending time on construction sites, may be just a thing for you. You are curious and you love to learn new things. You might ask why a lot, but that's a good sign, you know, engineering or a STEM field might be right for you. And it's okay with you, and maybe even preferred, if every problem doesn't have just one right answer or one right solution, that there's lots of different ways you can solve a problem. There's lots of different solutions. You just need to find the one that's the best fit for that particular situation. You might be an engineer. And with that, I think I will pause. I don't know, Lily, if you want to take questions now or if you want to wait till a little bit later when we get to panelist Q&A. check the chat and see if there's anything. Any questions?
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Lily, would you please share your video with us again? And that way you can ask any questions you have.
Yeah, sorry, my internet cut out for a second, but there was one question. So could you explain a little more about Anna Rightly asked, what is an architectural engineer? You already talked about that a little bit. But...
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So, I think what I describe in terms of the building enclosure is a lot of what architectural engineers focus on. If you were to study architectural engineering, you might also learn about lighting and light control. You'd get some background in plumbing and mechanical systems. You might do some material engineering, but it's really the engineering side of that architectural design component. So the more engineer, math, science piece of design of a building. There's several schools in our area that have great programs for that. I'd certainly, if it's interesting to you, recommend looking that up and seeing what they offer for courses.
Okay, thank you. I actually have one question. What were the unique classes that you had to take in undergrad that like other engineers didn't have to take?
Sure. So for civil engineering, a bachelor's degree, you'll take a little bit in everything. So I took environmental classes. I took highway design classes. I took hydraulics and water classes. But for my concentration, the sort of unique classes that I took was, structural design with concrete, structural design with steel. So very different concepts to design with either of those. Like mechanics of materials classes and understanding, all the different physical properties of different materials. Those are the ones that jump to mind offhand, Lily.
Okay, and then a question just came in. Okay, that is a question regarding a different engineering field, so we'll save that for the chemical engineer.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much, Emily.
I actually had two questions that came through on my chat. What are some of the challenges you face by being a civil engineer?
Good question. So it can be a very fast-paced job. When you're in the middle of building a building and there's questions or challenges or concerns, you need answers right away. For me, that's something I find really exciting and energizing about my job, is that sort of fast-paced, solving problems thing. But it can be a challenge when you have lots of problems to solve at the same time some days. And then I think, there's always a challenge with, I like to think I can make just about any design concept work. But sometimes that's just not the case, or that, what is trying to be accomplished aesthetically is really, really hard to make function. And those can be challenging conversations where we know those aesthetic things are really important to everybody, and trying to figure out how to make some compromises on those when you need to for the function of the building.
All right, so we have time for one more question. How much does CAD/SolidWorks integrate with being a civil engineer?
So we use all different kinds of software in civil engineering. I think, for me and what I see, we see a lot more of Revit and the BIM type softwares. But, you know, I think it really depends exactly what specialized field within civil engineering you're going into to answer that question specifically. But there's always new softwares coming out and integrations of different softwares that we're dealing with.
Okay, thank you. So our next speaker is Barbara Coughlin, who is my current calculus teacher, and she's a great teacher. She used to work as a mechanical engineer at Ford and among other companies, and she will discuss that in her presentation.
Good afternoon. It's telling me I can't start my video.
Okay, you should be all set now, Barbara.
There it is. Hi, everyone. So I'm Barbara Coughlin. I am currently the head of the math department at Wayland High School. And Lily roped me in on this one. So thank you, Lily, for putting this all together. And I just have to say, like, kudos to Emily Hops. I've known Emily for a while, and I know she does some really cool stuff, but she still impresses me with all the cool stuff she does. So I'm going to just talk about sort of my adventures through my early days and how so I have a degree in mechanical engineering from Lehigh University, and sort of where my career path took me and how having a degree in engineering has helped me through the years. So I would say, I think a lot of you are young and trying to decide what you want to do with your lives. And I think sometimes we feel the pressure that we're supposed to already know what we're going to do with our lives and have a mission. So first, permission for everyone not to have that. If you do and you know what you want to do, that's just like a bonus. When I was young, I knew I was strong in math and science, and that list that Emily just listed at the end of all the things that you do, I fit all of those. My mother used to get mad at me because I would take things apart and then get them halfway back together when I was a kid. But, you know, I was always fixing things, and I still, to this day, I'm always sort of like taking things apart and fixing them and wanting to figure out how things work. And that sort of led me to wanting to pursue engineering. But more so, I would say, I hate to say this out loud, I never wanted to be an engineer. I was never the one who, in terms of a career and what I wanted to do as a job, I never really wanted to be the one in the design room doing the actual computations, but I did always want to be in a very technical field. So my intentions when I went to college was to get a degree in engineering, work for a few years, and then go back and get an MBA. I was really interested in business, but was interested in being involved in a technical business. So the part of me that enjoyed studying engineering is always there and wanting to work with things and do things. But I really, in my path, had sort of a different pathway as an intention. So I do want you to think about why we go to college and what we study and what we do with it. And so many people, I think there's the expectation of, I know exactly what I want to do. I want to go get trained in it so I can do it. Like, I think a surgeon, you know, I want to be a surgeon, so I need to know and go learn how to do surgery. Or there are the people that are saying, I'm really interested in something and I want to go study it, so I'll go study it and then see what I can do in terms of finding a career. And I was sort of a little in the midst of that. I knew I liked engineering. I knew I liked figuring out how things work. But I wasn't sure that that's exactly what I wanted to do. I got some good advice from a few adults when I was young that said, get the most technical degree you can, because with a technical degree, you can then branch out from that. So I do think it's interesting to think about what, and I'm a little older, I think, than some of the other presenters, but over the course of your lifetime, what you want to do and what degrees really make a difference in that. So if you want to get a degree in law or an MBA or some of those pieces of how your undergraduate degree helps to feed into the bigger picture of what you want to do. So in any case, I went to Lehigh University. I got a degree in mechanical engineering. That choice was a bit broader for me. There were not as many choices when I was going to college. Lehigh was known purely as an engineering school. When I went there, they were just starting to bring in some more liberal arts pieces. It was also primarily male. It was an all-male school until 1971, and I went in 1985. So at the time, I didn't realize it, but that was a big part of my conversations and why I was doing what I was doing, which I can talk about a little bit more. So I was always interested in, had I had my druthers, I would have studied aeronautical engineering. I was interested in astrophysics and wanted to be an astronaut and all those sorts of things. I didn't have that option. So I picked mechanical engineering, and then I specialized in fluids. So I think part of what Emily was also talking about when you guys were asking about what courses you take, everyone, when we got there, like all freshman engineers took the exact same courses, physics, chemistry, like sort of your standard courses. And then sophomore year, mechanical engineers took one set of courses, electrical engineers took a different set. So like, depending on what type of engineer you were, sophomore year started to specialize a little bit more. But by junior and senior year, you were specializing even within your major. So the mechanical engineers had options of specializing in different pieces of, you take courses in materials and fluids and mechanics and engines and all of those sorts of pieces. So as you get to your junior and senior year, you can specialize in more of those pieces that are of interest to you. So there's flexibility even within your degrees about what parts of that you really want to spend more time on. So when I graduated, I got a job working for Ford. I should say I was working for Ford Electronics and Refrigeration Corporation, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of Ford Motor Company. Standing on its own, was a Fortune 500 company, but we supplied all the electronics and refrigeration components to Ford Motor Company. So we made compressors, condensers, evaporators. We had a fuel line division, but we did all of the mechanics that went into the air conditioning and heating units and built those parts. So when I was hired as part of a team that was, we were installing and developing a new assembly line, building automotive compressors. So as part of that training, I worked supervising and engineering on an existing compressor line, which meant I had to learn how all the equipment worked. I had to learn how factories work, how unions work. I had to learn how the process development for fine-tuning machinery went. There was part of it's just an assembly line and you're trying to keep it running as efficiently as possible. And then the other part is when there are machines that continue to break down or don't run at the highest efficiency, how do you redesign them to be more efficient and more productive? So I have to pause right there. The factory that I was working in was in Connorsville, Indiana. So it was the middle of the country. The factory itself was 40 acres. It took me longer. It took me less time to drive from my apartment to the parking lot than it took me to get from the parking lot to where I actually worked in the factory. So there were all kinds of things going on. And I just have to say, if you ever get a chance to go into a factory, go explore factories all you can, because some of the coolest stuff ever is going on in there. It is amazing to see the vastness of things, of just the volume of production and how things get designed, and also the simplest and smallest pieces of things. We had one component that in the pistons would run on a swash plate, and they were so finely tuned that it would measure. There was a machine that would measure the thickness of what was called the swash plate and pick from one of 10 shoes to sit on it. And they varied only by a couple of microns. And a micron is about the size of a tenth of a hair, a human hair or something. It's just amazing, the tiny little details of what goes on there. So I started working for them, and then I was also working as part of a team buying off on the assembly line on the equipment for a new assembly line that they were installing. So I was doing a lot of traveling and working with the team building a new assembly line, which included a lot of programming. It included a lot of mechanical adjustments to equipment. I wasn't designing the equipment itself, but we were working with the team that was building it to adapt it so that it would be more efficient once it got and was installed. So I did that for about a year and a half, and I decided that Indiana was not the place I wanted to be. So I moved back to the East Coast. I grew up out here, and went to work for a company in Woburn called Icon Corporation, which eventually bought out another company called Automation Unlimited. And we did custom automation. We built custom automation equipment primarily for the electronics industry, but we did a lot of custom work. So we made 3D positioning systems, which were the precursor to today's 3D printers. But we were doing work in the electronics industry. So if you think of assembly lines with circuit boards, the circuit boards would come through, and we would be part of the process for assembling the circuit board. So part of that was liquid dispensing. For the most part, that was either epoxies and glues, or it was solder paste. And the technology at the time was revolutionary, where we were dispensing solder paste, and then you would put surface mount technology on that would cook. And that's how you would solder the parts onto the circuit board. For those of you who know about electronics, it's not quite as revolutionary today, but it was revolutionary at the time. So in that job, so my job at Ford, I was doing a lot of mechanical work. In my job, when I came back here, I did my first job. My title was applications engineer. And so I worked as a liaison between the engineering department and the sales department. When we had new customers that needed something special, I would meet with them at the sales team, and then I would be the person that went back to the engineering department and said, okay, this is what we need to design. This is how they need it to work, and give the engineering department what they needed to know in order to make the machinery work. So I was the one at the customers saying, yep, we can make that work, or I don't know if we can make that work. And then we'd have to go back and talk to the engineers and figure out some different things. So that got me out of the direct engineering part, but I was doing more customer support and being a liaison between the engineers and the sales team, which is what I really liked. And that took me down some paths of things that I enjoyed. I worked for this company for about 10 years. And through those years, so I started as an applications engineer, which then took me I worked in the sales team for a bit, but really wanted to be more connected with the engineering department. So then I started doing project management, where I would, Motorola, for instance, was one of our big companies. And so we would have some big projects with them where we were designing new material, designing new machinery. So I would be the point person where I would coordinate with the engineers and the sales team and the production team. And I was in charge of keeping things on schedule and also making sure that we were building the proper machine that would do the proper things. So I was in charge of testing the equipment and running things off and doing those sorts of things. And as I did that, I got more involved in production, which I also really enjoyed, and then ended up taking over as the chief operating officer, which from that point I was coordinating production, purchasing, engineering, and coordinating with the sales department to sort of put all of that together. So my point there is I wasn't working specifically in the engineering department, although I did spend some time in the engineering department, but that wasn't really what I loved. And so having a technical degree allowed me to be able to do some of the other things that I wanted to do, but still have the knowledge to communicate with those people. So I wouldn't have been able to do what I was doing in communicating with the engineering department if I didn't have that background. So a whole variety of things, right, that I did, and eventually ended up switching careers, mostly because I had a couple of children, and my choice at that point was to be running this company. We were doing a lot of business in the Pacific Rim, which required a lot of traveling and working in the middle of the night on their schedule and as opposed to our schedule. And so I just made some life choices to change gears. But at that point, having a degree in engineering allowed me to move into teaching without very much difficulty. I took a couple of teaching courses, got my first job, and then went back and got a master's in education and another master's in administration. So I think my point is there are so many different things that you can do with an engineering degree, and you study what you love. And while you're in school, if you really, like, if you're devoted to one thing that you know you want to do, you can study that. But you can also then take that wherever the road travels. I think a lot of it so much is once you get out of school and you get a job and you actually start doing things and you say, oh, I really love that part, I want to go that way, or I really love that part and I want to go that way. And having a technical degree allows you to move in and out of those many different areas more fluidly. And in my opinion, opens up more doors. And then you look to what you want to do for graduate degrees, whether you want to go into, I think of mechanical engineers who then go get law degrees and work with people on the legal team, but also have the technical background in order to get into lawsuits about patents or about, failure or like whatever those pieces are, or into business or into like so many different pieces, or into the, medical field or whatever it is. So my message to you guys is that I think an engineering degree just gives you flexibility and choices down the line if you don't know exactly what you want to be doing.
Ooh, okay. Thank you, Ms. Coughlin. So we have some questions. Do you have any input on or advice for people who want to go into robotics, if that's a sub-concentration or if you've ever worked with specific machines like that?
Yeah, so I did some work in robotics when I was in high school and college. And I think it is the reason that I got the job at Ford Motor Company, because a lot of people weren't doing that at the time. And I remember them sort of afterwards saying, I think we're actually going to hire a woman to do this job. And which of course they didn't tell me until after they'd hired me. But I think there is so much in robotics that overflows into so many different pieces of automation, right? So there's going back to that conversation about factories. I am fascinated by factories and how they do things. And that's all about robotics, of figuring out exactly how to break pieces down into smaller components so that you can keep things moving. But I think that flows a lot into automation. Is there a specific question there about robotics?
No, it was just like a general question about robotics.
Yeah.
I actually have a question. How much programming is involved with studying mechanical engineering versus actually working as a mechanical engineer?
So, so this is where I go. I'm the old lady who I maybe Emily could answer some of those pieces more, but we all programming is sort of the language of all of it, right? So we, as a calculus teacher, I will tell you that I often say calculus is the language of engineering, and programming is the medium in which we use it, right? So all of these calculations that we do, that we used to do by hand, and now we can ask computers to do the busy work for us. So programming is definitely integrated into it. And then it's about what field you're going into, right? So what I was doing at Ford, if you can imagine an assembly line, you have a pallet of parts that goes around. There were 6 different assembly lines that built into the whole room that I was in, and each loop created a different part that then eventually assembled into a full automotive compressor. But each of those had to be programmed individually. And so I wasn't specifically responsible for the programming of that line, but I was an engineer involved in it. So we were always fine tuning it of, should the pallet be going over here or should it be going over there? And how do we, once it's been tested, where does it go next? All those sorts of things. So it was definitely a component of my job, but I'm sure today it would be a whole different story. I'd be fascinated to see what those lines look like now in terms of the programming and the automation involved in it. I will also say one other thing that may not come up today is there's also a part of engineering called industrial engineering, which is all about factory production of keeping things down. So we had a 9-second cycle in my factory. So every step in the assembly line had to be done in 9 seconds. So every 9 seconds, a compressor came off the line at the end. So some of those stops were just, somebody putting a part on the pallet or loading something. Some of them were assembly, but anything that we did had to be broken down into 9 seconds. Because that was whatever the shortest job was that can be done. So there were some stations that had 5, it would split into 5 lanes so that every 9 seconds you would still have a part coming off the line. So industrial engineering also plays into some of those parts, which I also find interesting. How do we do things the most efficiently?
Nice. Now we have another question about how did working in a more managerial position or a teaching position compare to doing more technical work?
How did I like it, or how did it?
What would be like the most significant difference between working in those positions?
Oh man. So I think in the big picture, I was always sort of in a managerial role, which I enjoyed, and how it plays out in different scenarios is different, but ultimately it's all kind of the same part, right? So working with people is all about taking care of other people's needs so that they can be working efficiently at whatever level that is. And I think that's true in any job. There are some jobs where you're just in a cubicle doing your thing, but outside of that, I think it's all about helping the other people on your team in order to produce the best results. When I left business and went into teaching, my intention was to do that for about 10 years until my kids were older and hop back out. And then once I got into it, I realized how much I loved teaching. So I have ended up staying now like 25 years into teaching. So it was totally different. And I think I would probably not have made that jump if it weren't for life things that affected it. But it's worked out really well.
Okay, that is all the questions we have for you, Ms. Coughlin. And now we're going to open up to 5-minute break or any other questions that come in. And also, Mrs. Hobbs, I was wondering if you could, build on what Ms. Coughlin said about programming in relation to architectural engineering.
Sure, I'm happy to comment on that. So I took one semester of C++ programming when I was in college. I think my day-to-day at work is not so much programming, although there is opportunity for that. But the really important part of having that background is we rely on programs so much to get our solutions that we really need to know how they work so that we know if we're putting in the right inputs and if our outputs make sense. That's where we see people go wrong, is they didn't really understand the programs and the software that they were using, and they just relied on the results without understanding it. So that's where it's been really valuable to me. I think as technology advances, there's a lot more opportunity for that. At my firm, I know we actually have a digital lab where they build their own pieces of software customized to what we do, or they do programming to integrate different pieces of software so we can do parametric analyses of things and look at how different variables affect different things. So, for me, I think it's not it's necessary to have a basic fundamental understanding of programming and how that works. It's not necessary to be a programmer to be successful, but it's going to continue to be an opportunity if that's a passion that people have to bring it into lots of different types of STEM fields, because that's just the way everything is heading now. Does that answer your question, Lily?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Okay.
This can, both of you can reply to this, but what was your biggest challenge in becoming an engineer? Was it studying, how difficult the course load was? Was it something else?
So I'll jump in. Do you mean successfully getting through college, or do you mean getting a job and working? Because those are two very different things. Getting through college, you guys all know the game, right? Like, you know how to be students, and you've been successful, and there will be struggles there at some point. But the other part is getting a job that you enjoy and working through that pathway.
This is actually a really hard question for me. Honestly, I think it's interesting that we have two women here speaking about engineering, because that was one of the biggest challenges for me in school, as being one of very few women in my class and in my classes, and having to work really hard to, be confident and feel like I fit in and not have that be a thing. So that was definitely, a challenge for me in engineering school. I think that has changed dramatically. I'm a hiring manager at my firm, and we hire, at this point, at least 50% of our new workforce coming in as women. And it's not because we have some initiative to hire 50% women. It's because they're excellent students, and they do, just as well as the men. So I'm happy that I don't think that will be as big a challenge for those of you on the call today as it may have been for me.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that is a really important thing that especially females in STEM need to consider, that it's going to be hard out there just because of what we were born as. So thank you. Let's continue on. So our next speaker is Regina Yu, who is a current quality engineer at Boston Scientific.
All right. Hi, guys. That is me. I have a presentation ready, so I'll just start. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes,
Okay.
you're good to go.
All right. Thank you. So I'm Regina Yu. I'm a biomedical engineer, and this is inside the world of biomedical engineering. A little bit about me. I live in Wayland, Massachusetts. I graduated from Wayland High School, and then I continued on and got a BS in biomedical engineering with a specialization in cell and tissue engineering, and minored in chemical engineering at University of Rochester, class of 2020. And right when I was about to graduate, that was when COVID hit, and I was robbed of my graduation and everything. And I was really looking forward to going out into the real world and finding a job. But because of COVID, jobs were scarce. And so I was very lucky that my professor came up to me and said, why don't you try for a master's? And I said, okay, sure. And so I got my master's in biomedical engineering, but this time with a focus in medical devices. And I recently graduated in May, and I have been working in industry since. My previous work experience, I worked in stable cell line development at QLB Biotherapeutics, which was a company focused towards cancer research and finding cancer treatment. I also worked on polymer extrusion for COVID testing kits at Thermo Fisher Scientific. And now I work as a design quality engineer at Boston Scientific for medical devices. And so more about the reason why I became a biomedical engineer. I was originally going to be a doctor. And it was my dad who said, I think you would enjoy being a biomedical engineer. You should try that. And I was like, okay, Dad, whatever. Totally planning on just quitting, moving to a bio, major. And I learned that I actually not looked forward to, but would procrastinate studying for my pre-med courses by studying for my engineer courses. And I think around then I realized I think engineering is more my, calling rather than, medicine. So what is biomedical engineering? My unofficial definition is it's the application of traditional engineering principles and problem-solving techniques to biology and medicine and devices. So I think this is what people think of when, expectations when they think of biomedical engineering. It's very high tech, upscale, robots, the future. And it is, in my opinion, the future. And, they also think, buckets of money. In reality, it's a lot of hard work, a lot of studying, late nights. Me and my friends, we used to say we have 5 hours of work to do, and we've only got 2 hours to do it. But it is a little bit stressful, but it's extremely rewarding, and I have no regrets. So this is kind of based off of my experience with biomedical engineering, but based off of definition that BME is applied to, is kind of like traditional engineering applied to medicine. Every specialty of BME had a corresponding traditional type of engineering. So for example, cells and tissue engineering, their counterpart was chemical engineering. Biomechanics' counterpart was mechanical engineering, and so on and so on. Biosignals was electrical engineering, and medical optics was optical engineering. Basically, what this means is we would take traditional courses with the traditional engineering students, but on top of that, we would have required courses that were specific to BME. As a cells and tissue engineer, I was basically a chemical engineer. That's why I minored in chemical engineering, because at some point I said, might as well get some credit for all the chemical engineering courses that I'm taking. But I also had to take quantitative physiology, biostatistics, biomaterials, organic chemistry, biology, which were courses that chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, optical engineers, they didn't have to take. And so I'm going to kind of provide an example of the applications of the different specializations of BME. So one device I think is really cool and up and coming is organs on a chip. And this is actually, I think, one of the professors at U of R is currently working on it, where we do a lot of testing in medicine, right, in order to prove that you can use this in humans. Ironically, in order to prove that, one of the steps to prove that it's safe in humans, we do testing on animals. And it's a little bit difficult to predict the outcomes sometimes of medicine that have been tested in animals, because animals have a different physiology than humans. We also do in vitro testing. That's kind of, lab testing. And that's also difficult to predict the effects in humans, because those, cells and tissues don't have the same biochemical, chemical, and physical cues that they have within a human body. And so the goal of, organs on a chip, lungs on a chip, is to mimic the behavior of how a medicine would interact with that specific organ or organ system, without using human testing or animal testing, but in an accurate manner that in vitro testing does not provide. And so we're not quite there yet with this technology, but I think it's very cool. I don't know as much about the other types of engineering specialty because I did not do them, but biomechanical engineering is usually more of an analysis of forces on the human body. They are heavily involved in neuroprosthetics sometimes. Not neuroprosthetics, sorry, just prosthetics. And so I remember for one project, we had to use coding to analyze how someone would stand up and sit down between someone who was, 60 years old versus someone who was only 19. And we can analyze the difference in forces and pressures and, body positioning between different age groups. So biosignal engineering, I associate that with the brain most of the time. That's just because there's so little known about, the brain that we usually use signals to try to estimate, oh, this means this, based off of the EKG or the ECG. We have, a stimulation, and then we make a guesstimate or, a scientific hypothesis, as they would say, on what that means based off of the output signals of the brain. Biosignals engineering is also used with, neuroprosthetics and, nerve responses, activation, etc. And then I think this is just very special to Rochester, but they had medical optics engineering as a possible concentration, which is, lasers. And I think that's just because Rochester really likes their lasers. But this is a disclaimer. This is extremely generalized and simplified for the sake of this presentation. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated. There's even more specific specialties within these specialties. And it's also not so simple within these boundaries. It's very mix and match, which I'll explain. So one of the projects I worked on my senior year was creating a phantom abscess model for photodynamic therapy. And so basically I was supposed to apply my knowledge as a cells and tissue engineer to try to come up with a model that would behave like an abscess within the body for treatment for photodynamic therapy, which is very much medical optics. But we had to create a team that kind of had their own specialty, and we would work together. More background on what photodynamic therapy is. Basically, one of an upcoming technology for treating abscesses was photodynamic therapy. This is just a fancy way of saying we're going to saturate the surrounding tissue of the abscess with methylene blue. And methylene blue is just a special fancy chemical that acts as a photosensitizer. So once it's exposed to light, it starts producing these reactive oxygen species that kind of eat away at bacteria, which kind of are the problem and the reason behind the abscess in the first place. So the idea was, okay, we can use light to get rid of bacteria within the body, the bad bacteria within the body. And it's really hard to predict the behavior of light, especially when abscesses grow they're really ugly. They're never perfectly spherical. And so we need to create something so that researchers, doctors can predict how the treatment is going to behave before they use it inside a human. And so our team approached this by using CT scans. You would get CT scans kind of take pictures of your body layer by layer. And so we had to join 600 CT scans to create a 3D rendition of the abscess, which you can see in this kind of green blob. And then it's a kind of an ugly blob. So we made it pretty, and that's what you see in the white blob. And so that enabled us to 3D print a life scale model of the abscess. And then we would take that model and change it into resin because of more photo properties, more ideal photo optic properties. And that would allow the researcher to try to research what's the best approach for getting rid of this abscess. Okay, so another project I was on was designing a better bone biopsy needle that's used for kyphoplasty procedures. Those are a lot of large words, but basically all you need to know is that within the spine, there are these things called vertebral compression fractures, which basically occur when your bone structure in the spine starts weakening such that it can't handle compression, just like large applications of forces, and it just compresses or fractures. And so this is usually the case within diseased tissues such as osteoporotic or malignant tissues. Or the older you get, the insides of your bone basically turns into like a cottage cheese like consistency, which allows it to bend. And so a lot of surgeons were having difficulty with this because they need to take a bone biopsy sample to see what's wrong with your bones. The irony is that the bone biopsy needles are designed for like healthy tissue, but it's most often used in diseased tissue. So what our team decided was to design kind of a trap door mechanism that you can see at the bottom two photos over there, to kind of trap in the sample, because a lot of the issues was the sample was coming out, and then it required surgeons to go back in and out and in and out with this needle in their spine. And it's problematic because it increases the potential for nerve damage and paralysis or infection and operation exposure. Basically what our team found kind of late on in the project was that it worked really well in diseased tissue. It did not work as well in healthy tissue, which is kind of the opposite of the current technologies out there. So maybe in the future, someone can combine, both technologies and we can have that perfect ideal needle, but that's what we worked on. I also did research for my university, where we created computational models for sensory neurohearing loss with birds. And so basically what is sensory neurohearing loss? It's not normal hearing loss, right? It's not that it's like you can be in a quiet room and you can hear every single noise perfectly, but you put yourself in a crowded room and suddenly you can't hear anything. And that's sensory neurohearing. It's your ability to hear when there's background noise. And so what we did was try to find out, to create models that could predict hearing based off of birds or budgies specifically, because they have very similar hearing thresholds to humans. And these aren't my birds, because I couldn't take pictures of them, but this is a pretty close setup to what we had, which is we had a box. They were in a soundproof booth, and we basically trained them to press buttons, and they get food if they press the right button based off of the signals that noise signals that we give, and basically how well they're able to hear the difference between the noise signals lets us know how well they can hear. We also studied their brain activity from the image, above, where this little guy has a sensor that's poking out that's surgically implanted in. Usually we can connect it to a sensor and just, see what's going on in its brain. And it was actually very cool. So what do I do now? I'm a design quality assurance engineer for Boston Scientific, and this is, my office, I guess. I'm pretty sure that's actually a security guard right there. He made it into the picture. But more specifically, I'm currently working on ureteral stents. And basically my job is to consider all worst case scenarios of a device. What can possibly go wrong? What can go wrong with our device, and how can it be used incorrectly? And to do risk analyses and calculations to make sure, or to, implement design changes so that those don't happen. We try to minimize that as much as possible. So some things that I think people should know about BME/engineering in general before, or at least some things you should really consider before you become an engineer, is that know that you will need to learn how to code, especially now that, we've kind of geared towards coding a lot. You will definitely, I think we had to take 3 semesters of coding, and after that, a bunch of courses just used coding for our homework. We would have like a normal homework part, and then we would have a coding homework part. Not that I would have changed anything, but I would have liked to know that there was so much coding in engineering. And I have a friend who recently went into a job for an aerospace engineering company, and her job was just to code every single day. Second thing is there's a lot of math. And I mean like a lot of math. Like Miss Coughlin was not joking when she said the calculus was the language of engineering. It really is. And I think it even gets more complicated than the high school level. And I kind of thought, oh, I already took calculus. I already know I'm good at math. But I went to college and it kind of knocked me off my feet a little bit. I had to, realize this is another level of math. It's multivariable calculus. You have to analyze things. You have to consider 3 dimensions. It gets a little bit more complicated. Test averages will be below 40, and that is okay. Engineering is known for being difficult in terms of exams. I think I had one professor, we had 3 problems on the exam. 2 of them were impossible to solve, and they just wanted to see how we would approach problem solving. And that's another thing, is that they don't care if you get the question right. I think usually getting the question right is just, 1 point. Most of the time, people don't even have an answer. They really just care about how you approach problem solving. And that's another thing, professors aren't going to hold your hand. I think it's a different environment than high school, in the sense that you can, like, professors, I think it's a lot less strict. You can interact with professors almost like a friend sometimes, but it is also not their job to remind you of homework assignments. They don't really, like, I think my first week of college, I completely missed an assignment because my professor just never mentioned an assignment. But when I made the argument, I didn't know there was an assignment. She said it was on the syllabus. And that's enough of a reason, apparently. So you really have to kind of keep track of that. And office hours are extremely helpful, though. Sometimes office hours are even more helpful than attending class. And lastly, I would say research and industry are 2 very different things. And that's something that, you should figure out which one you like better. Because they're just 2 very different things. Like, I came from a research institution. I had a lot of opportunities for research, but I did not have as much exposure about what industry is like. And so when I went into my master's, it was a master's that was more geared to industry. I had to learn things like FDA regulations, manufacturing and process control, and, human use errors, how things can go wrong when you have to consider humans are the one who are assembling products, and you have to account for that in your engineering. And as a result, if you're interested in industry, you should really consider internships and co-ops. And those are really difficult to get. And co-ops are really helpful because they provide you with industry experience. There's a lot of jokes these days where, when you apply for an entry-level position, they already expect 3 years of experience, which, by the way, shouldn't happen. And so basically companies want to know that you can work in an industry setting, but you're applying for these jobs, and when you have no experience, companies aren't letting you get that experience, which is why internships and co-ops are really just something you should keep your eye out starting freshman year. Highly recommend that. And lastly, what you choose in engineering, what you decide to do, does not define the rest of your life, and also does not define the rest of your career. I did my master's in biomedical engineering, and I met all different types of engineers there. There were chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, industrial engineers, who all just wanted to shift and focus on, the medical field. I work in a biomedical company, and a bunch of my coworkers, they aren't biomedical engineers. They don't have as much information on medical processes as, I do. And they're saying, I started off doing something and I decided that I wanted to do something else that's a little bit more interesting. I have friends who are biomedical engineers, and now they're going into patents, which is completely different and not engineering related at all. But basically, what you choose in college does not define the rest of your life. And yes, that's my thank you, Pig. That's all I have for now. I'm now opening the floor for questions.
All right, thank you. So our first question is, could you elaborate more on what taking quantitative physiology was like?
Quantitative physiology was a really interesting course. It was basically learning about human physiology, and I think that's the difference between a bio class versus a biomedical class. I think a bio class would just be learn, the physiology of the body, right? These are, these processes, this is how it works. And then quantitative physiology, a biomedical class, was saying, okay, we know this reaction at this rate. Now let's say this person is of this weight and takes this kind of pill who does this kind of reaction, right? Let's calculate the half-life of that medicine. How long does this stay in this person's body given X, Y, and Z, and then calculate that for us? Or, here is a diagram, and we know that this person, did something. Okay, how does it affect the rate of this reaction? Does it increase it? Does it slow it down? Etc. So it definitely has a lot more math. There's more problem solving. It adds math problems to biology situations.
Okay. Our next question is, was it a lot of work to get to where you are now? How stressful was it?
Yes, I would say that you do have to work hard a bit, and it's not just for biomedical engineering. For every type of engineering, you're going to have to work hard. There's a reason why engineers are kind of obnoxious. It's because we worked really hard. We're taking all of these courses, and so we complain. We're complaining all the time. And it's not actually because, like we should be complaining this hard. It's just, it just kind of gives us a reason, like, oh, we're working this hard. Yeah, like your course load isn't as hard as mine. Except kind of like to feed our ego. But you definitely have to work hard. There's definitely going to be long days in the library. You're going to be stressed, and depending on, how competitive you are, how hard you want to push yourself, you're not going to just stop at academics. A lot of my a lot of my friends, they were also working in labs, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll work in a lab, you know. A lot of people were striving for internships, and so you're kind of like, okay, well, everyone else is doing internships, it's time to apply. And so basically I've had to consider, you know, my future career at a very early stage, like since, you know, freshman, sophomore year. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who just kind of stumble across opportunities, or they didn't have as many opportunities, and it was perfectly okay. They were perfectly fine. You're definitely going to have to put in work at the end of the day, but also if you don't get, as you know, all the opportunities that I'm saying watch out for, you're probably also going to be fine.
All right, thank you. The same attendee asks a follow-up question. Because of how much time you have to work, does it take away from spending time with family or doing other things? Is your free time limited? Maybe talk about both undergrad, master's, and then also your work life now.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I would I would say yes and no, right? Do you have a lot of free time? You kind of make free time for yourself in the sense that, you know, sometimes you can't really push yourself any further, and you're like, I need a break. You should always figure out when's a good, like, what are your limits, and take a break, right? I was someone who I think went to extremes, and I would pull all-nighters. I also had friends who were saying, okay, this is it. You know, if I'm not going to learn anything tonight, like this, if I'm not going to learn anything at this point, like if I were to continue studying, it would be counterproductive, and they would just go to sleep. There was always ways for us to, you know, we would go and hang out on the weekends. Like my social life was not influenced. I was still able to have a social life. I ran a club, a dance club, and I made friends there, and we would bond over there. I made engineering friends, and honestly, it was like problem sets are difficult, and it's a crazy and wild time, but that's honestly some of like my most memorable, you know, moments in college, was doing problem sets with my friends until like 3 a.m. and we would just, you know, bond over this impossible problem set. You're capable of having, you know, fun moments even when you're miserable. And that's undergrad. I would say during masters or, you know, grad school, it's a lot easier. I think people think, you know, oh, it's grad school, it must be more difficult, and it still is challenging, but I would say grad school is a little bit easier in the sense that you have more confidence in yourself. You know, professors tend to look at you more as an equal, or they're not trying to, you know, dump loads of work on you, and they're a lot more understanding towards you and your problems, etc. So yeah, I would say my master's was a much nicer experience than undergrad. And then now in my job, it's fantastic, I would say, compared to undergrad, which was studying 24/7. Now I just do work 9 to 5, shut my laptop, and then, you know, I have the privilege of saying, okay, I don't have to think about work until I get to work tomorrow, you know, once I'm done. And if anything, now I'm trying to, some people might say I have too much time on my hands these days. So I'm really enjoying life now as opposed to undergrad.
Okay. We have one more question. This is kind of about your minor as a chemi. Could you explain what being a chemi is like, and maybe what kind of courses you take as a chemi?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so basically in terms of what being a chemical engineer is like, I can't tell you because I don't really identify as a chemical engineer. Some courses that we took with the chemical engineers was first we took fluids, then we took heat and mass transfer. Thermodynamics was honestly the worst one. I think went in and the TAs were like, oh yeah, he and mass transfer, we would say that difficulty is a 9 out of 10. This class, it's a difficulty 10 out of 10. Let's begin. And it really was a difficult course. That was the course where I said we had 3 problems, 2 that were impossible to solve. I don't think that's a common thing. I just think that's because my professor was from MIT and really believed in pushing us. But in terms of what do chemical engineers do, I can't say from personal experience because I'm really not a chemical engineer, but I, for my minor, also took a course called, biotechnology. That was a chemical engineering course. And I was like, woo, sounds great. Sounds very similar to what I'm doing now. I'll take it. I also took a course called solar cells, which was basically designing solar panels. So what we did in that class was just learn all about solar panels calculations relating to, I want to say solar stuff. That's like the best way I can put it. I was able to design my own solar panel with an efficiency of 32%. And also I have friends now who do a lot of work on polymers. Global warming is honestly a concern of a lot of my friends, and they're trying to figure out ways to kind of fight that. I'm not going to pretend I know about chemical engineering. I've been really focused on biomedical engineering. I just have a lot of chemical engineering background.
All right, thank you so much. So we're having some technical difficulties with our chemi, so we're going to move on to Alex Peruta, which is our college consultant specializing in STEM.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much, Lily, for inviting me to participate today. So I wanted to start off by giving a little bit of background on myself. So I do have a background in STEM. I have degrees in biology, chemistry, and biochemistry that obviously overlap with a lot of different engineering fields. But I do not necessarily have specifically just an engineering background. But because of my STEM background, I've transitioned many years ago into working with students and being a college counselor. So I work specifically often with students who have some sort of interest in STEM. It may be engineering, it may be math, it may be medicine, and working them, figuring out what their interests are and sort of how to pursue those. So I want to spend time talking today about developing an interest in engineering. How do you get there? As many of the people who've already spoke today have said, it's really important to think about what your interests are, think about what could be a good fit for you, realize there's all these different areas of engineering, and kind of move forward. So I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint to go along with my talk. And I just have to, 1 second, turn on the presenting mode after I share. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. So the first thing that I want to spend some time talking about is, like I said, how to develop and show interest in engineering. And I think that a lot of students hear the topic engineering. It's kind of like a hot topic word. I think that's great. I think there's a lot going on in engineering, but I have had many students come to me say, I want to study engineering. And frankly, they really have no idea what engineering is. They've never had an engineering course in school. They've never done something outside of school. They've just heard it. They know it has to do with STEM, maybe problem solving, and that's kind of where their experience ends. So I want to talk about some ways that you can get involved in having some exposure to engineering, sort of at the more low-key intro level, and then how you can kind of take it up from there if you do find you really do have an interest in engineering overall, or a particular area of engineering. So I wanted to point out a few things, and I've put some things on the slides here. I'm going to touch on some of them, not all of them, but I know the presentation is going to be recorded and be available for everyone that comes. So you can always go back and stop screen if you want to look at a specific resource that I included in some of my slides. Of course, feel free to do that. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is, there are online resources available. If you're a student, you've heard about engineering, you're not really sure much about it, there's a lot of places that you can really go to see more about the different areas of engineering. So I left, 2 up here. Engineering.com and Born to Engineer are both really good options. Born to Engineer talks about many of the different disciplines in engineering to kind of just give you an overview and start to give you a sense about what's involved. And I think that can be a helpful place for a lot of students to start to see if there's one or a few different of those fields that kind of piques their interests. You can see like sample projects that engineers work on, things like that. And sort of, I think the explaining that Emily and Barbara did earlier, as well as Regina, to give you some examples of things they've worked on, they kind of do this on this website as well. So you can see if you connect with any of those. But then in addition to these online resources, you do have other online options besides websites that I like to, make reference to as well. I think a couple things that I've seen, TED Talks are actually a great resource. So if you've heard of TED Talks before, it's usually a short talk given by some sort of expert in an area that they're interested in and very experienced in. There's a lot of fantastic TED Talks relating to engineering, design, all these types of things that come together, super interdisciplinary. And I've definitely had students watch TED Talks on different topics in engineering and outside and be really inspired by the talk and what they hear and start to develop an interest in something. So I think those are great. I also gave some podcasts here that I think are pretty interesting to listen to. There's some that are about engineering overall and how it applies to everyday life. There's also some that are very specific to like a certain subset of engineering as well. And then although it may seem old school, there are still quite a few like actual print publications and then online publications that relate to different fields of engineering. I just put them in the category of magazines. And I say magazines as opposed to scholarly research journal articles, because if you're just beginning to explore your experience with engineering, you don't want to maybe get too technical and you want to have more of an overview that's kind of made for the public. So I find these resources can be really helpful. And then there are, of course, books that I think can be a great opportunity. I encourage a lot of my students to try to, if they're interested in a particular area of study, is there a book related to that interest that maybe they could work through reading parts of? I feel like through books, you get a lot of narratives and stories of specific people doing a certain career, and you can sometimes connect with it better through the eyes of someone else initially, as opposed to just sort of reading a brief description on a website. So I included quite a few here that I think are great as well. And I remind students that what you learn about STEM, what you learn about engineering, doesn't have to come from a textbook. There's lots of other good options. So if you're a student who has kind of explored some of these earlier options, you've looked online, you've read different resources, you're starting to have some sort of exposure to engineering, and you think it's something you might be interested in, I think it's a great idea to talk to someone who's in engineering, has an engineering degree, has a career connected to engineering. I just said it as like an engineering mentor, because, what a lot of speakers have already said today, it's really important to kind of figure out where your interest lies. You may figure this out in high school. You may figure it out in college. You might figure it out later. But if you're doing the exploration, I definitely think talking to individuals that are in engineering fields and how they got to where they are can be incredibly helpful to understanding what the process can be like. The three people that have already spoken took very different paths and what they went with, what they studied and what they're doing after. And I think that's the interesting thing about engineering. It's very interdisciplinary and it applies to so many different areas. So I think finding someone that can be a mentor or at least give you some overview of engineering is quite helpful. This is something we would do with students. We try to pair them up with different people in different areas of STEM that they can really learn from and figure out if maybe this is something they're truly interested in or maybe that they're not. And that's completely fine as well. Once you've done sort of that initial exploration, I do remind students that you can extend a lot of this to potential high school course selection and what you do in school. And I say that because, with what I find with a lot of high schools is that you don't always have engineering courses available to you. Sometimes you don't have them available to you at the earlier grades. Sometimes, frankly, the school doesn't have them at the later grades. So a lot of students will say, I have an interest in engineering, but there's nothing I can take. But that's not always the case. There are so many fundamental classes, like Barbara mentioned, calculus being the language of engineering and Regina reiterating that. other classes you can take that really would relate if you decide to pursue engineering in the future. And I tell students to try to keep an open mind at this stage when you're in high school, like explore different courses, different areas of interest. I know most schools, require you to take, potentially biology, chemistry, and physics, but then you're often allowed to take electives, and you might take an elective in biology or in chemistry or potentially in physics or math, something like that, in computer science work that could then connect to engineering later on. I also tell students that it's a little tricky. You do want to plan early when you're thinking about your coursework in high school, because if you feel that there's the potential that you may want to apply for engineering when you're applying to college at the undergraduate level, there are, for certain engineering programs, certain expectations of courses you will have taken by the time you graduate. For a lot of them, it may be that you've taken through calculus for math, that you've had at least, a year of physics. It's a little bit going to depend on the school, but we recognize that for a student to be able to have had some of these courses by the time they graduate, they may need to plan a little bit earlier, because when you're in 9th or 10th grade, what you take in the level you're at could potentially affect what you're able to take as a junior and senior. And then, the other thing that I tell students is, if there's a particular area of STEM you're interested in, or a particular part of engineering that you're interested in, and your school doesn't have a course in it, do be open to the idea of seeking opportunities outside the classroom to sort of fill in with things. That's reasonable. Students do that all the time. And there's a lot of great resources for exploring engineering, like outside of the classroom at that next level. So in reference to that, one thing that I want to discuss is that there's a lot of fantastic ways at this point to take online classes related to like engineering, or a lot of those fundamental areas that would then connect to engineering. And they really fall into kind of 3 different categories. And there's online classes that are not for credit. They're usually shorter classes. They're very introductory about something. There's courses for credit. You can take courses potentially online for college credit. And then there's courses that give you a certificate showing that you completed the course, right? Sort of like as proof. And usually the courses that you get a certificate in, as opposed to the non-credit courses, they involve a little more work. They might involve quizzes, tests, a project to sort of make sure you're applying what you've learned and that you truly have like fulfilled your understanding about that subject. And so I think they're all good options. A lot of my students, when they're initially exploring things, might do a non-credit course that's maybe 2-3 weeks long, something like that. And then maybe they move on to like a certificate course if they find they really do like the area that they're sort of doing online coursework in. And then oftentimes, some of my older students, I would say mostly my students who are juniors, maybe during that junior year, if they have time, or more often like in the summer, might do a course for college credit if it's the right fit for them, and they can find a class that is something they're interested in, and they have the right background and prerequisites for it. I've definitely had students do this in different areas. I know, for example, Lily has taken a course for college credit this past summer, and my experience is that if you can find the right course, it can be a great experience. It gives you a little bit of exposure of what it's like to be in a course with college students. What is it going to be like to take a course in college? And, college work, as Regina mentioned, is definitely different than high school work. So I think that exposure is really helpful. The other thing a lot of people don't know is that on the college application side of things, there is a place specifically that asks if you've taken a course for college credit. It's not required, but if you have, you can report what you've taken, where you've taken it, and the kind of credit that you got. So colleges really do look at that as well. And down here, I just listed some examples of places that you could potentially do online coursework. edX and Coursera mostly offer non-credit and certificate. And then a lot of the colleges and universities, even the local regional colleges, offer courses for credit that you can apply to take as a high school student if you're qualified. So then something else I want to talk about then is gaining actual sort of like more hands-on engineering experience. Like, how can you do that? If you've generally explored your interests, you've maybe found an area of engineering you might be more interested in exploring, you've taken an online course, what can you do from here? this piece is pretty important because colleges, if you down the road decide to apply for engineering, any real engineering area or STEM area for that matter, at a college, they oftentimes want to see that you've really explored your interests outside the classroom, that you've had some sort of experience, because all of these areas of study, they're difficult when you get to college. I mean, there's more work involved. There's lots of in-depth things you need to do. They're manageable, but they require a level of commitment. And colleges recognize that. And so they're hoping, if a student is saying, I want to apply to be a mechanical engineer, for example, that the student has a better understanding of what's involved with that, has had just even some sort of baseline level of experience. So it's important to build your understanding for your own benefit, but also to show that to colleges. So I think the other reason that hands-on experience can be important is sometimes when you transition from learning about something generally, or maybe even in a classroom setting, you're really interested in it. And then you have a hands-on experience and an internship or potentially like a research program. And you sometimes realize that this subject is not for you, and that's perfectly acceptable. But I like to stress that learning about something in a classroom or, in an online sort of initial setting is quite different from actually engaging in that subject in a hands-on manner. I mean, I had that experience myself. So I mentioned my degrees are in biology, chemistry, and biochem. And I took all the classes in college associated with that. I mean, I had a great experience. And then, I went on when I graduated to do medical research at Yale University in infectious disease. And I had other colleagues, students that graduated with me who then went on to have these like heavy in-person experiences after they graduated. And many of them didn't like it and sort of changed what they decided to do. They didn't want to be in research, or they didn't want to be in academia or industry. I was fortunate that I had hands-on experience in high school doing research actually, and in college, and kind of had already had an understanding about what that was more like. So when I got to my, first job and a research experience when I graduated, I felt more comfortable with it. I knew more of what I was getting myself into. So I think that's another great reason to try some hands-on experiences. Okay, so how can you develop hands-on experience? Kind of at the intro level, your hands-on experience could absolutely be associated with school activities. So maybe you join the robotics club or the math club or the science team, something like that, to get some initial exposure. There are absolutely schools that do have engineering clubs as well, but so many of these other areas obviously connect to engineering and can give you a good foundation. And I do tell students, if you're really motivated and you can't find a school club at this point that's related to an area of interest, you really could potentially establish it yourself. If you've taken the steps to know that this is something you're truly interested in, you feel passionately about it, there's probably other students that have an interest as well. That is kind of, that is an option and something you can do. And I've had students do this in the past by working with, a representative at their school who can really help them set up that. So it's always something to consider. It's also a great form of showing leadership. If you have an interest in something and you create a club associated with it, or maybe you bring back a club that used to exist, I've seen that happen too. You can not only really enrich your understanding of the subject through the club, but you can also show to colleges like you are a leader in certain ways and you feel passionately about this topic. So another way that you can gain experience besides, clubs associated with school is through summer programs. And I think this is a great opportunity to explore your interests further, because it's a time period where most students aren't taking normal classes like you are during the school year, and you have a little bit more energy to focus on these other things. And there's different types of summer programs. So one style I call is a liberal arts style summer program. So I call it liberal arts because it's a program where you apply to the program, and once you're admitted, you get to select from many different courses that you can take. Brown, for example, has a great program They have a pre-college program, or once you're in, you can choose from like hundreds of different courses in so many different areas. And I like this option because, again, if you're still exploring your options in engineering, you're not completely sure. If you go to this style program, you could do an engineering or like related course. You could also explore another course in another area of interest, but it lets you do it in a little bit more of kind of a, like I said, a low key manner for some initial exposure. And usually these courses in the summer are shorter and they're not for credit. But there's plenty of other programs that offer them. We have some great programs if you're in the Boston area. BU has a fantastic program as well. Harvard has a pre-college program. A lot of the local and regional colleges will offer them as well. So there's like a lot of options to consider. The one question I get from students so often is, does it matter where I take the course? Like, do I need to take my course at Harvard, or can I take it at Middlesex Community College? It really does not matter. It's about finding the course that's the right fit for you, or the program that's the right fit for you, and it's going to help you explore your interests and have that exposure. So don't really worry about the name of where you're taking it. Focus more on the fit of what the program is offering to you. The other, or next, I should say, type of summer program are engineering more focused summer programs. And so a lot of the same colleges, universities, will offer these more focused programs. So instead of you applying and then choosing a few different things to take, you are specifically applying for and doing their maybe engineering program, maybe even their mechanical engineering program, something a bit more specific. So a lot of my students will do this in a later summer, maybe after their sophomore year of high school, potentially, if they have already tried kind of intro liberal arts, more engineering style program. And there's a lot of great places that offer this style of programming to students, especially if you're in the local area, but there's ones really all over. And then the final option, I know I alluded to taking courses for credit a little bit earlier, but if you've really developed a strong interest in a particular area, you can absolutely take a course for college credit in like maybe engineering, or potentially kind of like a foundational topic related to engineering. A lot of my students, if they end up doing a course for college credit in person or online, are more often going to do it in the summer when they can devote more time to it. I think if it's a good fit for you and you're comfortable with doing in person, it's a great opportunity. You get to interact with classmates. You get to interact oftentimes with other college students taking the course in the summer as well. You get sort of a lot of times different FaceTime with the professor or with the study groups and things like that. And it can be like a really great experience. And like I said, we have tons of local programs that have good options. And some of the programs for credit related to different areas of STEM, and definitely engineering, will offer the course and then a lab component. And I think that lab component is a really great idea if it's something you want to consider, because it gives you that hands-on experience. In sort of labs at the college level are longer, are a little bit more intentional, and oftentimes a little bit more intense, to be honest, oftentimes than labs associated with high school courses because of scheduling, and it's just kind of more limited in the way the curriculum works sometimes. So this can give you a different type of kind of lab experience, which I think is great too. And again, like I said, something you can put on your college application. And then sort of the last way to kind of gain that hands-on experience, right, is through shadowing, apprenticeships, or internships. I think these are a great option. I know Regina mentioned them in terms of having them in college, and that help you get experience for when you're applying for your first job or even jobs in the future. And I 100% stand by that. I feel that what I see with students, and even in my own experience as someone who majored in STEM, the students who had hands-on experiences like co-ops where you're taking time away from classes and you're working at a company oftentimes where you're getting credit for that to gain hands-on experience during like a semester, or just an internship you do in the summer, something like that. I saw that oftentimes the students that have that experience are having more success in applying to grad programs sometimes, and definitely in securing jobs. Well, you can also try to gain hands-on experience in high school. I'm not going to say it's the easiest thing to do. It takes a good amount of legwork, but it is absolutely possible. And it's something that I do talk to students about, that it definitely helps you stand out a lot in the college process if you've decided you truly have an interest in engineering. If you can have seen projects firsthand and worked with a mentor in this type of capacity, it can help you grow, and it can really help colleges understand your level of commitment to the subject as well. So I have so many students that ask me, how do I secure an internship? How do I secure a shadowing position? That sounds so difficult, but it's absolutely something I'd like to try. It's something I'd like to do. I say in my opinion, there's a little bit of a system for doing this at the high school level. As someone who worked in a lab where I a lot of times worked with seeing what students we were going to kind of allow to do shadowing in our lab or to do internships, whether that was high school students or whether that was undergraduate students. I have a pretty good understanding of that process, especially from like the academia, like research side of things. And it's really about showing your motivation. It's really about showing that you've done some background, some legwork, and that you're there to contribute. So I tell students that if you have an interest in a certain area of engineering, like look at different departments at different colleges and look at different professors. They, next to their faculty profile, when you go to the department's website, will list what research they're doing. And if their research sounds interesting to you, you can look at some of the papers, some of the things that they have written, or at least the abstracts to get an even deeper sense of what they're working on now. And when you conduct that thorough research, you can sort of put a list together of people you might be interested in working with. And then from there, you can really begin to create some emails to reach out to these individuals in a more tailored way. You don't want to just send the same mass email to 20 labs or 20 professors that you're interested in working with. You want to be able to write a specific email to the professor in this lab saying, dear Professor so-and-so, I've been doing research on this area of engineering for the last year or the last period of time. I've done this, this, and this already. I feel a hands-on experience would be like really beneficial to me. I've, read about your work in this, this, and this. I read your research paper on this. I find it's very interesting. Ask them a few questions about the research. Start in that manner, right? Rather than leading in with just a specific ask. And that can really help. You're showing them you have an interest. You're showing them you're motivated. You've already done things. You're showing them you could be a benefit to their lab, for example, as opposed to a burden. And that's a big thing when they're considering potentially letting a high school student come on board. So, I work on this outreach protocol with a lot of my students to help them with, with internships. But if you send out emails, it's going to take time. There's, you have to send really a lot of them. Realistically, professors, researchers are really busy people. They have a lot going on. It's nothing against you personally, but don't just send one or two and get discouraged. Usually, in my feeling, it's about 10% kind of return on response. Send 10, you might get one back, and that's fine. It just takes finding that right one, right? And if you are fortunate enough that you make contact with multiple people and you're trying to figure out how to move forward, besides looking, of course, on what their topic is about, look for someone that seems to have good mentorship traits, right? Someone that was willing to answer your questions, someone that says, they'd be willing to spend some time with you if you were in the lab, not just assign you to another person in the laboratory. I mean, that could be fine and you could have a great experience, but you may want to work with that person directly if at all possible. So, or someone who may be invited to let you come down and see the workspace, see the lab, see what they're working on. I really find that, although it may sound surprising, what the lab is exactly working on and the topic is not nearly as important as finding someone for an internship or a shadowing experience that's going to be a good mentor to you. That makes all of the difference. You will learn so much more. And there's always opportunities in the future to learn about another topic. When you are engaging in these hands-on experiences, I tell students it's really important to try to make the most of these experiences. And sometimes students don't think about this till much after the time period. And so what I say to students is you need to make sure that you document what you're doing. So if you're doing shadowing, you're doing an internship, what were you observing them do? Or what techniques were you learning in the particular lab? If you're doing a biomedical engineering lab and you're working with tissue, maybe you have to learn how to do PCR, maybe you have to learn how to do gel electrophoresis, all of these different things. Keep track of them, have a document going, summarize what your work is as you go, because later on, if you want to talk to people about it or you want to write about it, it can be hard to remember all the details. And, try to form relationships with your mentors, whoever you're dealing with regularly in these positions, not just like the head researcher, but maybe the technician or the other people that might be assisting you. They can be fantastic resources. If you have success in the internships and the work that you're doing, potentially you could be in a position to consider having your work submitted. Maybe that's you attend and you present at a conference. There's even high school conferences for high school students about their research, or potentially a publication. And some students go on to incorporate some of their work into other science competitions as well. So ways to sort of document and kind of take the experiences they've had and do a little bit more with them is always something to consider. So the other couple pieces I want to talk about is if you've kind of gone through this process of exploring engineering, looking at the different areas, having different types of experiences, and you really do think it's something you want to pursue at the college level, then what do you do after that? Where do you go from here? You have to think about the college search process. And, I just want to touch on this briefly, but the idea, and this comes from, what many of other speakers have said, engineering is a really broad topic. There are so many categories within engineering. I've given some of the biggest ones here. Like some people will divide engineering into like 5 branches, 5 categories: chemical, civil, electrical, industrial, mechanical. It kind of depends on who you talk to. But then the important thing to remember is under every one of these categories, right, there's many specializations. And these categories even themselves don't include all types of engineering. And so many types of engineering now are very interdisciplinary. So you could have an interest in more than one of these areas. Like Regina mentioned that even though she's a BME, she has a Chem E minor, right? There's a lot of overlap that can happen. And I think there is a lot of space for even more kind of interdisciplinary majors within engineering. So having a sense about what area you're interested in, you want to consider that actually in the college search process, because different schools are strong in different areas of engineering. And you may not know yet what track you're interested in. You may not know by the time you apply to college, and that is okay. Some schools have strong kind of fundamental engineering programs, but for certain specialties, if those are areas you have an interest in, like maybe aeronautical engineering, not every school offers that. That may be something you want to consider looking at certain schools. And what I want to do is talk a little bit more about school types. Okay, there's really kind of 2 categories of schools when you think about things academically, and definitely think about engineering. We have explorer schools and path schools. Explorer schools are schools that you are just applying to the college or university. You're not applying to usually a specific major or specific sector of the school. You want to be a student there. Once you arrive at that school, you usually have a year, depending on your interest, maybe 2 years to explore those interests, try different things. That's when you then declare your track, your major, and then you move forward with that. Schools that fall into the explorer category tend to be more liberal arts style institutions oftentimes, because liberal arts, gives you the option to study multiple things. Some of these liberal arts style colleges do have engineering as a major. That is a possibility, or other areas of STEM. So, you may not get your undergrad in specifically engineering. Maybe you get it in biology or chemistry or something else, or physics maybe, and maybe you do part of your, your real engineering degree at the grad level. Like that's a possibility. So explorer schools, I think, can be good if you're not 100% sure about engineering, or even if you're not particularly sure about the track. Some explorer schools offer what's called like a dual degree option, which are often called like 3-2 programs. And the idea is that you start at one of these liberal arts colleges taking like your fundamental classes that you need to take, exploring your interests, and you're there for typically 3 years. And then they have a program with another school who has very specific engineering tracks where you do your next set of schooling, your next 2 years after the first 3 at a different school, specifically in their engineering department, in their engineering program. So it kind of lets you pair things together. Yes, your experience ends up being like a year longer than a typical undergraduate experience, but you end up getting degrees from both schools in most of these cases, and it gives you a little bit more time to explore and then kind of lead into that. The other types of schools are really path schools. So we usually call these direct admit schools. And this is schools where when you apply, you're specifically applying to a certain area of study. Maybe it's engineering, maybe it's history, maybe it's English, maybe it's something else. So at a lot of these schools, you have to declare when you apply, I am applying to be part of the engineering program at like minimum. They at least make you choose that. And then some of them will say, that's where you start. Once you're here, if you're admitted and you decide to come, you'll take the fundamental classes that many engineers take across the board that oftentimes have to do with math, physics, things like that. And then once you progress in these fundamental courses, then you'll choose your track of what you want to study. That's kind of like a mid-level path school. The more extreme path schools are when you apply to the school, not only are you applying to be in the engineering program or the engineering department, you are applying for the specific track of engineering you're interested in. This requires you to be a bit more sure of your interests. I tell students it's not impossible to change off these tracks in college to another track. It is difficult. And sometimes if, you applied for chemical engineering and then you have a change of heart and you decide you really like civil engineering for some reason, some of the classes you already took may not apply to civil engineering, and the civil engineering program might be full. They may not be able to switch. So this is an option. These like pure direct admit to a specific major, specific track programs, they are an option, but I say to just be cautious about them because you want to make sure you've done a lot of the legwork, you've done the research, you really truly feel this is where your interest lies, because once you're in it, it's a little bit more difficult to transition and change. And then the last thing I want to have a briefly mention is how do you take the interest that you've developed, the experience that you've gained, like the understanding you have, and how do you leverage the interests that you have and all the experiences in your actual college application process? And I say that because I have a lot of students who do fantastic things in high school, online coursework, they do an internship, they restart a club, so many different things, and they don't know how to convey it to an admissions office to show everything that they've put their blood, sweat, and tears into over time. So I want to talk about that a little bit. There's different ways to show your engineering interest and experience in the college search process a little bit before you even get to the applications. So a lot of schools have STEM or engineering specific college tours that you can attend. And many schools track this, that you come. So if you apply later, they're going to know in a lot of cases you came to the engineering tour, the STEM tour. Also good for you to get better understanding, of course, at what programming they offer in these areas. Potentially, if you have an interest in a very specific area of engineering, you might reach out to one of the professors in engineering in a particular area to ask questions about their track, their program. Some schools will let you sit in on classes that are oriented towards STEM and engineering when you come visit. Some will also do it in an online format. And then, of course, you can really further show your interest if you apply to a specific engineering program at the school when you do submit your application. To get a little bit more into the application piece and where you can put your interests, Common App, it is one of the main application systems that students use to apply to college. There are others, and there are ones that are specific to certain schools, but Common App is kind of the biggest, where many schools place their applications, on this website through this database. Students apply to Common App to many, many different programs. And within the Common App, there's different sections that it can be really helpful to talk about your engineering experience and your passion for it. One of those is the activity section. There's a section on the application that asks you to talk about what activities you've engaged in. You get to put up to 10. And I say that if you did an internship, you took a course, you did something else, this is a great place to talk about what you did. There's also an additional information section that students sometimes don't realize is there that you can take advantage of. The Common App gives you 650 words, which is pretty substantial space to provide any additional information. If you worked on a project and maybe you developed an abstract for it, or something like that, you did some level of research that you're really proud of, and the description you can put in the activity section, which is only basically a sentence, isn't enough, you could absolutely add that information to the additional info section. And then there's also a section where you can list and mention the courses you've taken for college credit. So if you've taken some of those, you can reference them here. And then some students may end up talking about engineering or STEM related interest in their main essay. This is not a requirement by any stretch of the imagination. I have students who go to engineering programs and all types of other STEM programs who don't mention any of that in their main essay. Their main essay could be about something totally different, and that's fine. But sometimes it's a good fit, maybe based on the prompt that you choose to write on. It could be a good fit. Like they ask questions about, a realization that you've had that's made you think about things differently or think about a situation differently. Like maybe some experience you've had related to how you learned about engineering has made you look at the world differently. So there's lots of different ways you could potentially incorporate your engineering interest into your application. So besides a Common App, main information, every school has their own subset of specific questions they get as well. They usually give you a place to upload like a resume. So you can obviously include your experiences there. Some will give an additional document upload where you could potentially put like an abstract for a research project. And they do ask questions, they're called supplemental essays, that go specifically to individual schools. And these supplemental essays often ask, like, what's an activity that's important to you? Why are you interested in this major? Very common question. Or why are you interested in this academic area of study? Or why are you interested in a particular school, right? These questions are going specifically to the individual school that asked that question. There's so many ways here you can talk about your interests, showing them that you're applying for biomedical engineering and these are the different things you've done to gain exposure to that really says a lot to the admissions office. And one of the other things is there are certain schools that do interviews. So it may be an opportunity to speak about some of your experience and your interest there with the person interviewing you for a particular school. Absolutely. The last piece I want to talk about very quickly is there is something else you can do to really show your interest in your application. And this is what I usually call a STEM supplement. It could be an engineering supplement specifically, or a STEM or engineering portfolio. And I think that a lot of students, if they hear about submitting a portfolio to college, they think about visual arts, performing arts, like an artistic portfolio, which is absolutely true and is an option. But you can put together a portfolio of sorts that has to do with your interests. So what I talk about in an engineering supplement is it's really kind of this long or somewhat long PDF document that you craft, that you put together, that you're going to upload to a particular school if they allow that opportunity, or you may submit to them, that includes kind of the different ways that you've touched on STEM and engineering in your time since high school started. So often it's got an abstract. It's got an engineering specific resume that has what coursework you've done that would be related to that, maybe volunteer work that you've done, summer programs, research internships. So instead of putting it in different places in the application, if a school allows you to upload a certain type of portfolio, you can do that here. It may include a reference that someone will be submitting a letter of recommendation on your behalf. Your recommendation doesn't go in the portfolio, but if you worked with a researcher who's willing to write you one, you can reference it here, and then they can actually submit that to the colleges and universities. If you're thinking about an engineering supplement or STEM portfolio, I would definitely say, have a conversation with someone about it, have a conversation with your guidance counselor, or maybe a teacher who has that background, or, outside counselor like myself, if you're working with someone or you're thinking about working with someone, just to get a sort of second set of eyes about how to put it together, because you want it to come across well, right? You want it to be kind of a nice presentation that's a good culmination of the work and effort and energy that you've put into things. That is the major things I want to say. I think the biggest thing is get involved, try different things, explore different options, see where your interests really lie. And if they lie in engineering, fantastic. Then you've had those experiences and you can show them to the schools that you are interested in. I just wanted to briefly say, so I'm an outside counselor that I work with students. We work with students on all the types of things listed here. I know I said a lot in my presentation. I know a lot of other people gave fantastic information on what they've said, and there's going to be a Q&A after this. But if anyone feels like they have specific questions to them about anything I talked about, I'm happy to jump on a 30-minute call with anyone and just talk through things with you, answer questions if you have them. I work with lots of different students with lots of different interests, and I find I can answer most questions in the STEM and engineering area. So feel free to reach out if that is the case. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are any specific ones at this time.
Okay. So our first question is, how would taking a program such as CSAP or NSLC be beneficial towards showing interest in engineering toward a college or university? And also
Sure.
maybe say what those programs are.
Okay, so well, I'll lead it with one of the examples. So NSLC, so National Student Leadership Conference, it is an outside organization that over the years has crafted many different enrichment opportunities, mostly summer programs for students in various areas, not just engineering, not just STEM. There's ones in law too, all kinds of things. And they host these programs at different colleges and universities around the country. And students can, apply and register basically to participate in this program. And I think that you just have to be careful when you're choosing the programs that you are interested in and kind of what level you're at in your dedication. I find that a lot of, for example, the NSLC programs are kind of a mid-level program. So they're not necessarily introductory, like 1 week. There are a couple that are that short, but a lot of them are a little bit longer, a little bit more significant. So make sure that you've had some initial exposure, hopefully, to the topic if you're going to commit to a 2 or 3 week program, especially if you're staying at a specific campus. But if you know that's an area of interest, great. I think that as far as leveraging it in the application process, colleges do appreciate that you're exploring your interests outside the classroom. I will say you don't have to attend like a quote unquote prestigious program in order to be successful and show that you're really interested in something. So some of these programs we're staying on campuses they have fees and they can be quite expensive. If you have the means to do that and you're really interested, fantastic. Some of them do offer financial aid opportunities, but you could also, do a local program, create a project of your own where you're researching an engineering topic and reach out to individuals in the field and also have a similar experience. But I think if it's a good fit, like those programs can be helpful, and you can definitely include your experiences in your application.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we had is, maybe some of the other engineers can hop on this one as well. Can someone who majors in physics enter electrical engineering or software engineering later on?
So I can give my 2 cents, and then I've definitely other people have experience. It's gonna really, you're gonna hear this a lot, depend on the school. So just to clarify, I'm not sure if they're saying they're majoring in physics, graduating in physics, and then going on to engineering for grad school. I mean, that's definitely an option. If you're thinking you're majoring in physics now and you might want to change to an engineering track while you're an undergraduate, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's definitely, I'm being realistic, not always the easiest. Engineering is one of those departments and areas at most colleges and universities, if they offer them, that are very, very popular. And so a lot of times some programs have caps on them. And so they will only let in so many students. So if you want to transfer to that and they're full, it's not an option. If you think that could be a case for you and you might I want to start with this, I may want to move to this, I'm not sure. Think about that and do the research when you're building your college list, because you can contact schools and find out, can I transfer, from one area to another? And is what I might want to transfer into one of those majors that anyone can transfer into, or is it capped? That's something that I would consider. So I'd say it's just going to depend on the school and the situation.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi.
Maybe go ahead.
I just thought I would provide input in that actually one of my engineering professors, biomedical engineering professors, was originally a physics major, and he had completed, I think, his physics PhD to the point where he was attending these physics conferences. And he said that the big reason why he changed from physics to PhD was because physics, at least the part of physics that he was involved in, was very theoretical. And he felt like there was not really all this point to knowing all this stuff that was all theory and there wasn't any real application. I'm not sure if that technically, his transfer from physics to BME is technically applies to everyone, since he already completed his PhD in physics and everything. And BME is definitely a lot more accepting of different types of engineering and physics majors. But it's definitely possible.
All right. Our next question is, would it be good to enroll or transfer into a high school that is more geared toward engineering?
Yeah, fair question. There are not a lot of high schools, honestly, that are specifically geared towards engineering. I mean, there are a couple. I know of a few magnet schools or like STEM schools. I mean, I think it depends on you as a student. So, and what the opportunities are going to be. So if you're a student who has very limited opportunities at your school, they don't, maybe it's a small school, so they have a pretty small curriculum, and they don't offer some of the classes that you'd want to take related to engineering, and they don't have an engineering like club and things like that. I mean, you could consider it, but I'd say that's something to be careful about because, I think I've had in all the time I've had STEM students and engineering students who have successfully been admitted to, gone to college, and maybe even some of them are on to graduate school at this point. Very, very few of them have been in an engineering or like a STEM focused high school. I think those can offer you certain opportunities, but you'd want to make sure that the opportunities they're offering you are vastly different from what you can have at your current school. Like if you just feel your school doesn't offer a ton in the STEM department, there are things you can, or in the STEM department, sorry, there'll be different departments. There are things that you can do. And honestly, I find that depending on the school and the resources that they have available to them, teachers, guidance counselors, they really want to work with you. They really want to help you succeed. Like Lily has a teacher that presented today, right? So, and has a background in engineering. So by interacting with other individuals at your school, you may be able to have STEM opportunities you wouldn't have thought about, or mentorship opportunities, and they may be help you find opportunities. Doesn't always mean you have to transfer to a STEM specific school. And I don't feel like those students are getting admitted to STEM programs at colleges at like a particularly higher rate than students who don't go to STEM specific high schools.
I'll also jump in on that and say that when colleges are looking at applications, they consider what's available at your high school. So if you've taken the courses that are available at your high school, then that's an advantage to you. So going to a magnet school can be an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage.
All right, we're gonna have just one more question. This is more geared towards BME. Or actually anyone who did a master's, what was studying for a master's degree like, Regina? What were the advantages of doing so?
Okay. For me, studying for my master's, I think usually there's some kind of dissertation or a thesis that you have to prove. And for, my program, our version was designing a medical device. So it was actually a very cool program and I highly recommend it. Basically we started the program with a surgical rotation. This involved 2 months of, waking up at 5 a.m. and going in and observing surgery. And it was basically for us to just observe, okay, and engage with surgeons and nurses and see what kind of devices are already out there and what are the issues with these devices and how can we improve on it. And so then we spent, after the first initial 3 months, after taking notes and going through this very long process of deciding what we should tackle, we finally decided with the bone biopsy needle route, where we said, this is the problem that we should tackle. We can totally come up with a solution for this. And after, so we started the surgical rotation back in August, and then around September, that's when classes started up. So we were also taking, courses on the FDA, and I was still taking more courses on tissue engineering just because that was something I really enjoyed. That was my passion. You have, kind of more freedom to choose what classes you want to take. And I would work with my group and come up and design, a medical device when we're not in class. And so the first semester was, I guess, more paperwork oriented, I guess. And then the second semester was more hands-on, building the device, going into lab, making sure we follow COVID, guidances and procedures and etc. But it was really just building that device, prototypes, 3D printing. We still had to take some more courses. My program even made us take, a business course to try to have us have like a full understanding of, what it takes to design a medical device and make sure it's applicable to the market and it has, the potential to grow within the market.
All right. So we have another question about BME. Did it ever get overwhelming with the course load and the research associated with biomedical engineering?
Yes, I would say I would be lying if I said, oh, I had everything under control every second of the day. But I think that applies to high school too. There were moments in high school when, you're applying to college and there's the SAT and the ACT, and it's all overwhelming. So I would say, yes, even, in college, it will definitely get overwhelming. BME will get overwhelming, and you're trying to juggle a social life and you're taking on more adult responsibilities, and you're also, trying to study, and, you're doing research, or you're trying to find internship opportunities, or you're trying to get scholarships, etc. It does get hard. But at the end of the day, I think it's a very rewarding process, and, all the hard work has really paid off. I'm very happy where I am now, career wise, and I have a lot of self-confidence in my ability to tackle, to problem solve, anything really. One time, the toilet stopped working and me and my roommates were all like, engineers, women in STEM. And we figured out how to fix that toilet on our own. And so it's just stuff like that.
All right. If there are any other questions, please send them to me in the chat. And I'd like to ask Alex what the benefits are of having a college consultant.
Yeah, fair question. I think it's going to depend on the individual student and their situation. I think that, some students go through this whole process, don't have any sort of outside counselor, and some students do. So I think it's a little bit dependent maybe on the resources at your high school as well. I think that there are definitely some advantages, at least the work that I do with students. I do have a STEM background, which I think is a little bit different from, honestly, a lot of college consultants or outside college counselors. And I think that understanding some of those nuances of research and the fundamental subjects can help me help my students. I think it can also be helpful to help students find the right fit for different things that they're pursuing in high school as well as in college. I say fit because it might be fit in a summer program, it might be fit in an internship, what courses they may choose to take, what they decide to major in, or how they decide to apply to different colleges. I think that guidance counselors in schools do a great job, but they have a lot that they have to do, understandably, for a lot of them. And teachers have a lot on their plate as well. I mean, I say that speaking from the fact that my dad has been a high school math teacher for forever and then became a professor. And they care about their students. But I'm fortunate enough that I get to focus on the college admissions piece. So in a typical year, I visit 50 or 60 colleges, and I belong to multiple professional associations where we're constantly learning about what's changing in admissions. And as a counselor, I specifically stay up to date on that as much as I can. And I think that's what helps me help my students, those extra things that I have the time to do, and ways that I can help them because I get to know them on a really individualized level and spend a lot of time with them.
All right. So one more question that we have is, other than just meeting the prerequisites for an engineering college, what kind of classes should they take to help them study for becoming an engineer?
I don't know if anyone, I mean, I can definitely take that partially. So I think that it's really going to depend on your area of engineering. I think that, I don't think it hurts for a lot of students to make sure they try to have a strong foundation in math. A lot of areas of engineering do include physics as well. But then I think it starts to come down to if you have an interest in a certain specialty or track, like if you have an interest in biomedical engineering versus chemical engineering versus something else. There may be other related courses that you want to consider that are going to give you a strong foundation connected to those areas. Like a chemical engineer, in addition to taking their intro chem course, or maybe they're in the right place to take AP Chem, or a few of my students' schools offers a 1 semester elective in organic chemistry. But I also think just classes that make you think and problem solve and challenge yourself, think outside the box, interdisciplinary classes that schools offer to get your gears going. Like Regina was saying, like a lot of her exams and things like that in problem sets, it wasn't that they were getting to a final answer. It's like, how do I approach? How do I problem solve? How can I do that? So I think if you can stretch your brain a little bit in high school and take an interdisciplinary course or a course that's going to challenge you in a different way, that can also be helpful. It doesn't have to be like specifically engineering oriented.
And just to add on to that, I remember one time I was a teacher assistant for BMU 101, and I was talking with the professor, and we were grading the exams, and it was very obvious that some students were doing better than the others. And I remember the professor saying, that's kind of when a high school background really kind of, you start to see how, effective it can be, because some people, it's not because they don't think like an engineer, they just aren't used to this level of math and they can't pick it up as quickly as other people who have already been exposed to this level of calculus, can do so. And so, that's, I think, one thing to consider. Another thing that Alex talked about that was really interesting was like organic chemistry, and how engineers kind of think more about problem solving. I remember when we were taking organic chemistry, all the BMEs, we were like, oh yeah, this is great, this is fun, it's like solving a puzzle. Meanwhile, all the pre-meds were like, this is a new level of, problem solving that they've never really come across. And so they were doing not as well on the tests. And so it's kind of just about training your brain. And maybe that's why getting like a consultant that's more, specialized in STEM can be really helpful. Just having more exposure to these programs that know, the ins and outs, etc.
Another question just came in about which test is the better option, ACT or SAT? I know this is a hot topic, but also, Alex, I want to know your opinion on version.
All right. So I think there's 2 ways to approach the question. I get asked by students all the time, what's the better test to take? And we advise students on it. We do test prep. So I not only know the overview, but I was doing SAT questions and ACT questions earlier today. So I think one way to think about it is, do colleges have any preference between the two? Realistically, they do not. They will take either test happily from a student. Some students are like, oh, I think I should take the SAT. The SAT used to be more popular in this area based on kind of how it was founded. When you talk to students in the Midwest, they're all about the ACT, to be honest. A lot of them don't take the SAT, but they're both accepted equally. Colleges don't have a preference. I tell students to try to keep an open mind and go for fit. There are differences between the tests, a little bit in the content, a lot in the format and the approach of how they ask questions. And these are things that you should take into consideration to find the best test for you. So just because your good friend, your cousin, your older sibling took one versus the other doesn't necessarily mean it's the right fit for you. And taking the time to figure that out usually means a better starting place, better foot forward, and honestly a higher score in the end. And to give a super quick synopsis there, I tell students, do the diagnostic testing. So we do in our office, like we have an office in Lexington, We do SAT, ACT diagnostic testing most weekends for students, because when you take both, you can compare more equally. And then we put it on the same scale and leveling it in the same way that colleges do, because they'll get some kids that submit an SAT and some that submit an ACT. So they're able to really look at them on one scale and be able to compare them. So we do the same thing. So I suggest doing something along those lines. And I mean, you can get a hold of tests and do some of that yourself as well, or go to a place to do that kind of testing. Biggest differences I find between the two: the SAT is very much about logic, reasoning, and complex passages and topics, a bit more so than the ACT. They balance out this complexity and number of question types and how they approach their questions and their wording, with giving you a little bit more time per question. Whereas the ACT, it's a bit more straightforward, a few less overall question types in most of the sections. But their balance here, their trade-off is less time per question. So it is a faster paced test to get through. And so there's a lot of other nuances that go into that, but that's kind of just a starting place. But overall, they really do not have a preference between the two.
All right, so that was our last question. Do any of the speakers have any last comments they want to say? Okay, then otherwise, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this event. We will be sending out an email with the pre-recorded video from the chemical engineer that unfortunately we couldn't present today. And I will put his email in that email too, since he said that he was open for questions. And attached to the email will also be a resource packet with a bunch of summer programs that high schoolers can participate in. And so, yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone again for attending this event. And I hope you've all learned something about engineering and also what your own prospective paths will be. So thank you.